Thank you for joining us today, Safe, Vibrant, Healthy Communities Committee. We have two items on our agenda today. One is revenue capture options, and the other is the Midtown St. Albans Area Plan. We'll start with the revenue capture options, and Ken Bowers.
Thanks. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's a different microphone last time I was up here. All righty. So
They're trying to mess with you or what?
So we're here to talk about revenue, or I'm using what I think is an industry standard term, value capture. So we'll talk about what that is and what mechanisms are available to municipalities in North Carolina to do value capture. So we'll start by observing that local governments undertake actions that increase land value. And the two major categories are we build some public infrastructure. Maybe that's transportation infrastructure that increases access to a site. Maybe it's utility infrastructure that provides water and sewer service where it didn't exist before. And that causes land values to rise. The other thing we do is on the land use policy change is allow bigger developments to be built, typically through some sort of upzoning process. That can also increase land value. And so value capture is a means to realize as public revenue some portion of that increase in value through various revenue-raising instruments. And that's a definition that comes from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, which has done a lot of research and publication on the topic of revenue or value capture. So I think it's important to think about where do land values come from? Urban land values basically come from the value that can be derived from building on the land. And so zoning, what's allowed, obviously influences land value, and infrastructure availability also has a major impact on land value. And then there's things outside of the control of local government that also increase land value. So market demand, physical constraints unique to the property, is it encumbered by steep slopes, wetlands, or other constraints? Is there contamination on the site that has to be cleaned up? And then the location and amenities. And all those things can change and evolve over time. So if you're in a low demand area, you can zone for very large buildings, but if there's no market for very large buildings, zoning alone cannot create value out of thin air. It can only create value to the extent that there's demand for the thing that you're zoning for. So we'll get to what I call the residual theory of land value. If you're a developer looking to buy a site, you're going to say, what can I build on this site? And when I'm done building it, what's it going to be worth? And for most commercial real estate, the value is entirely based on the operating income of the property, which is the rent minus expenses. And you apply a little ratio called a cap rate to that and come up with an estimate. This is what my building will be worth. And then what's it going to cost me to build it? So I've got hard cost of construction. I've got soft costs paying my attorneys and my architects and my land planners. I've got investors who are expecting a certain level of financial return on their equity investment in the project. And I add those things up, and then I subtract them from the estimated value of the building, and what's left is the residual, which is what I can afford to pay for the land and meet all those other costs, including my investor expectations. And if something happens that lowers the value of that project, like say rents soften or an expense gets added or something, or we have an affordability condition, for example, on a residential development that lowers the rent roll, all those other costs have to stay the same. It's still, construction costs haven't gone down. My professionals still need to get paid, and my investors still expect a return. So what can get squeezed out of this equation is the land value. But if I can't squeeze the landowner for a lower price, then maybe my project doesn't happen at all. So what are the, what we're talking about is increase in land value because land, that's an unearned increment. If a city builds a piece of infrastructure and land values go up, the landowner didn't do anything, didn't make any investment, they profited off of that. Whereas a developer did mobilize capital and take some risks and build something. So we're really targeting about how to capture value out of that unearned increment in land value. So what are the tools to do that? There are various flavors of special assessments. Those are taxing districts that levy an additional tax on top of property within the district. And then I'll also talk a little bit about tax increments and tax increment finance. The thing to remember about tax increment finance, though, is there is no additional levy and there is no additional revenue produced from tax increment finance versus using some other mechanism to finance the public improvement. And then what are the tools to leverage land use change or upzoning? There's development agreements, there's zoning conditions, and then there's bonus programs. And you may not think of a codified zoning bonus program as a land value capture mechanism, but I will argue it actually is a land value capture mechanism and potentially an effective one if it's calibrated properly. So, revenue capture tools. There are 3 types of special assessments that are enabled for local governments or for municipal governments in North Carolina. And they're contained in Chapter 168. There's Article 10, which has been on the books for many decades, which is special assessments for certain types of infrastructure. Then there's Article 10A, which is newer, originally adopted in the mid-aughts. It's been renewed a few times. For some reason, it was adopted with expiration dates, and that expiration date has been put out forward. An interesting provision in the statutes for assessments, but not very widely used in the state, and I'll offer my theory as to why it's not very widely used. And then Article 23, municipal service districts, like the downtown municipal service district run by the DRA and the Hillsborough Street one. There's also a form of special assessment. So Article 10 special assessments are really limited to real sort of nuts and bolts, bread and butter infrastructure, streets and sidewalks, utility infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure. And the statute allows for a number of different bases for the assessment. It doesn't have to be tax value. It could be frontage along a street. It could be land area. It could be value added, which is a calculation of how the infrastructure investment is adding value to the adjacent property. It could be the number of lots served. We used to use sidewalk assessments. Those were under Article 10, and it was based on frontage length because it was proportionate to the amount of sidewalk that was in front of your property versus the entire project. Petitions are not required. The local government can impose a special assessment district for water and sanitary sewer and stormwater projects, but you cannot do it for transportation projects. There is a petition requirement. When we get to Article 10A, there's a much, much broader use of projects for which bonds can be issued. So it's easier to list the things that are not allowed than to list the things that are allowed. And among the things that are not allowed are stadiums, arenas, and golf courses, sort of recreational facilities of that nature. A petition is required, and it's a fairly high bar. You have to have a majority of the property owners, and they have to represent at least 2/3 of the assessed value within the district in order to impose one. And you can bond against the assessments and collect that prior to the project completion. So once you've established the district, you can issue debt instruments against the revenues that will occur within that special assessment district. And because it's an extra tax, and it's both property that increases in value as well as property that stays static, does pay into that revenue pool. Now, if you look for case studies, there's not a lot, but the one that's closest to home, and this is from 2013, is a master plan development in the southern part of Hillsborough, North Carolina, called Waterstone. And this was a project that was stalled by the recession. And what the town did was they said, we will build 2 of the pieces of infrastructure here, and we will get paid back for that investment through a special assessment district. So they issued public bonds to do the street and the park, which are highlighted here. It was about $6.8 million. It was to be paid off over a little over 10 years. And it was a portion based on the estimated value of other parts of the development. So as this development built out, they would update those assessments and adjust the rate accordingly to meet the repayment schedule for the bonds. And I think one of the reasons why this worked is that during the recession, the developer is having trouble getting some of the financing together. So by providing an alternative form of financing for some of the mandatory public improvements that were associated with this, they no longer had to get bank financing for that, and that made financing to other parts of the project easier. And of course, as lots there's a lot of, this was, had a large for sale residential components. The homeowners buying into the finished product picked up those property tax payments because they were in the assessment. Obviously, they knew about that going into buying a house, that there was going to be 10 years of assessment on it. That was probably a factor in what the sale price was in the houses. But, unlike other traditional financing mechanisms where the developer borrows the money and then is responsible for paying it off, in this case, the end users picked up the payments when they acquired property within the area. So why is it so rarely used when it was obviously very useful in Hillsborough? I think for any potential special assessment district that has a lot of owners, the petition process is hard. And it creates a first mover problem because it's hard to get a bunch of folks to agree to tax themselves if they don't know exactly what they're getting for their money in terms of the project. And it's hard for the municipality to get a project together if they don't have a funding source for it. So how do you crack this nut? I think it's difficult. And the reason why the Hillsborough thing worked well is you were dealing with a single development entity, a very well-defined project scope, and a very clear financing need. And then the last one is municipal service districts, and we think of these as primarily funding services. So, in downtown, we fund the ambassadors and a clean and safe program, and we fund ongoing marketing activities and things of that nature. But you can also fund capital investment. But it's a lot easier to do it on a pay-as-you-go basis than it is to do it with debt because you can't use the revenues, even though they're as predictable as any other revenues in a special district. Under the state law, you're not allowed to bond directly against them. You have to use some sort of other bonding mechanism. Now, if you're building a thing that produces revenue, like a parking deck that you could use revenue bonds for, you could put municipal service district revenues into that. But if you want to use general obligation bonds, it's actually a higher bar in a municipal service district because you have to do a referendum both citywide as well as in the district. Now, in terms of the petition requirement, there's no petition requirement to establish a municipal service district. As I think you all are aware, having just gone through some recent hearings on them. But there is a public hearing requirement, and you do provide an opportunity for folks to make a case as to why they should be excluded. But generally an easier lift than 10A, which is why municipal service districts are fairly widely used, both in Raleigh and in other communities in the state. So what about tax increment finance? How does it differ from these? So the way tax increment finance works is you draw a district based on some criteria. In many states, this was a tool of redevelopment. It was based on a blight study. It's not the case here, but you have to draw a district, and it incorporates property that's going to benefit from the investment you're making. You freeze assessments within that area, and the assessments that were on the books at the time the district is drawn continue to go into the coffers of the city and maybe county and school district. But any future revenue growth within there is set aside to pay for the infrastructure you're providing in the district. So you capture that revenue growth and you either use it, pay as you go, or you issue debt instruments against that revenue. So just a stylized version of this, you create the TIF district, you got a baseline property value that continues to go into the general fund and to other taxing districts. The blue triangle is the increase, the tax increment, which is used to fund projects within the TIF district. And then supposedly at some point, the TIF district should be terminated when that infrastructure is paid off. And then all of the assessments start to go back to the taxing jurisdictions that have given it up during the life of the TIF district. I will say that you may have heard, that tax increment finance got kind of out of hand in California, and then Governor Jerry Brown several years ago eliminated all the redevelopment authorities in their TIF districts. It was partly because they were never going away. They had become a sort of permanent fixture in the state, and something like 11% of all the real property in the state of California was sitting in a tax increment district. So is it a value capture mechanism? I'll start with the con argument, and the con argument is that there's no new revenue created by a TIF district. It's the same tax rate as if you didn't have the TIF district. It's just you're setting aside the revenue increment from a certain geography and spending it on things in that same geography. But if I use some other financing mechanism, the revenue and expenditures would be exactly the same. The argument pro is that you wouldn't have done the public investments that created the additional value but for the TIF financing mechanism. That's the pro argument. And I think, that argument is going to land differently if you're a city like Raleigh that has a lot of different options for how you can finance things, or if you're a city that's maybe in economic distress and is looking at a tax increment district as a way to create value in a situation where you don't have a lot of other options for how to raise revenue. So is it useful in Raleigh? I mean, I say the one thing is if you do to tax increment, because of our low property tax rates, you have to have a very large ratio of private to public investment. So it's kind of the mere act of creating such a district does pass a certain cost-benefit test. However, you don't need to use tax increment finance to do that same calculation. You could do the calculation but use GO bonds or revenue bonds or two-thirds bonds or some other type of debt instrument to do the same things. And since we generally have more favorable ways to borrow money for capital projects, it's not a tool that we have used. And the actual formal enabling statute, which is called project development financing, is very cumbersome. In places like Chicago and California, they would do these districts on a very speculative basis. And Houston's another example that has a ton of TIF districts. They'd say, we're going to invest in this area based on this tax increment and recycle the tax money from this area back in there to support revitalization. And then they would go off on a fishing expedition to find development partners to invest in the TIF district. In North Carolina, you have to have a development partner kind of identified and a pretty fleshed out development project to do one of these formal project development financing districts. And as a result, most people who are saying they're doing TIF are actually using some different bonding mechanism and are just calling it that. Like they'll call it synthetic TIF, like the parking decks for the Bull Stadium or some of the other projects that have gone along. So that's the special districts. I'll get to the land use tools. Conditional zoning is something very familiar to the council. 160D has the enabling statutes for land use regulation and provides authority for conditional zoning. And of course, as you're well aware, any conditions that are imposed have to be agreed to in writing by the property owner. And they also must be acceptable to the city. And the statute, says, puts some guardrails on conditions. It can't be just anything. It's supposed to address something that's related to adopted policies and plans or impacts associated that would be created by the zoning action that's being undertaken. So conditional zoning is obviously used a lot. It could be considered a value capture tool in the sense that the upzoning is creating value and you are trying to get some additional conditions to capture some of that value for public benefit. And then there's development agreements, which is a more flexible but also more complicated tool, typically tied to a rezoning action and allows for the sharing of financial responsibility for infrastructure and public facilities. So, and they can also include impact mitigation measures beyond those that would typically be allowed under zoning. So a development agreement is kind of like a contract. Again, you can't do anything with it, but you can do more with it than you can do through zoning conditions. And that's a tool that City of Raleigh has just started to really use, and we've done one, and we may have another one that comes before the council within the next 6 months or so. Fenton was a big development agreement in the town of Cary. So interestingly, the existence of the development agreement was committed to in a zoning condition, and the actual development agreement itself was adopted 9 months later. So although the zoning set the stage for the development agreement, it was two separate actions. They weren't voted on at the same hearing. It set forth a lot of infrastructure obligations to include streets, upsizing of sewer pipes, some off-site transportation facilities, and a greenway trail. Again, off-site transportation facilities so that you could not require through just zoning, but you could work into a development agreement. The developer agreed to finance and construct all of that public infrastructure, but there is a reimbursement schedule in that agreement. So the public sector ended up offsetting a lot of that cost of it, but the financing and the construction management was all taken on by the private partner for Fenton. So that was an example, again, of capturing value because there was value associated with all those actions. The financing had value to it. the construction management had value to it, and then some portion of the cost being paid by the developer had value to it. Now, there is, I think, a key limitation about how much you can do with these types of negotiated proffers that are done through the zoning process. And that's a lot of the zoning cases you see. There's a developer at the podium and a landowner kind of behind the scenes. And what's happened is the developer has optioned the property at a certain price. And so by the time they're in front of you, the land value is already set by that negotiation. And of course, in a competitive environment where you have many developers potentially bidding on a piece of land, if you want to win that, you got to bid a healthy price for it, and so you're very sensitive to things that are going to lower the value of the final project, because then you're kind of squeezing unless you can go back and renegotiate that price that you're paying for the land, you can't really exact value out of the land. You can only try to exact value out of other parts of the cost structure of the development in order to have a financially feasible project. Now, if conditions could be predictable, then you could factor that in, and everyone knew what was coming, and you could factor that into your calculations as to what you think the land is worth. It could work, but a lot of the times those conditions are not predictable, and so that's a limitation, because folks going into a negotiation to purchase a property have to make a calculation, as to how they're going to emerge on the other end of the zoning process and what they can reasonably afford. I can remember one time when a developer faced with a request for a condition said he would go back and renegotiate with the landowner, which he did, and came back and said, okay, I can agree to this condition to lower the density of the property because the landowner has agreed to lower their price. But it's rare. I've only known of that happening once. Maybe it happens behind the scenes. So what can you do instead of negotiated proffers? Well, you can try to put bonuses into your zoning code, which we have done with the frequent transit development option and the TOD zoning. We have a bonus program that allows you, for a certain level of zoning, to build a bigger building if you provide an affordable housing set aside. And the nice thing about a codified program is it's completely predictable. You know going in that if I want to go from 3 stories to 5 stories, I'm going to have to produce X number of affordable units in my project. What is the cost of that? I can calculate that and get a project value. And I think a bonus program, if it's calibrated properly, would produce a land value that's a little bit higher than the non-bonus project. So, for example, if I'm going from 3 stories to 5 stories, and I've got a graphic here to illustrate this. So I've got a 3-story building, has no affordable units in it, and it produces a certain land value that I can pay and have a project that's financially feasible. And then on the other side is if I could build 5 stories without any affordable housing, that would produce a higher land value. But what's on offer in the bonus program is a 5-story building with affordable housing. And if that land value that project supports is not as high as the land value that the 5-story with no affordable housing would support, but is higher than the 3-story project, then that's going to be very attractive. Someone who wants to build the 5-story inclusionary project is going to be able to bid more for the land than someone who's stuck at the 3-story level with no inclusionary units. And so, and the captured value is that difference between the land value supported by the bonus project with the housing and a 5-story building without the inclusionary units. So that's why, to my mind, a bonus program is definitely a form of value capture. If implemented consistently across the board, it'll suppress land values, and that's where the internal subsidy comes from to finance those affordable housing units. So the conclusion of my presentation is that in North Carolina, I think our most useful tools for value capture are some flavor of special assessment district or a codified zoning program. Of the 3 types of special assessments, the ones that require petitions are difficult to implement and are rarely used because of the coordination problems of trying to get that to happen. In my opinion, tax increment financing and other types of tax increment schemes are not true value capture mechanisms because you don't have a special revenue raising mechanism that's capturing any more revenue than you would if you just spent the money from some other source and the tax value in the area increased. And that codified zoning bonuses are a better way forward than trying to do negotiated proffers because they can be predictably factored into the bids for land. And by applying them across the board, obviously more projects will get swept up in a codified bonus program. I think the caveat there is you have to pick your targets. The target we picked is affordable housing. If you start picking a bunch of other targets, then you probably some of those targets will never get used. We had an experience like that long ago in our prior downtown zoning scheme where we offered height bonuses for a lot of different things. Affordable housing was on the list with 5 other things, and guess what? The 5 other things got chosen before affordable housing was chosen. So if something is truly important to you, that's probably the target for a bonus program. But I think as we've shown, if a bonus program is properly calibrated so that the bonus project's a little more valuable on the land side than the non-bonus project, then the bonus program can achieve its objective and it can do it consistently. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, that was a lot. Do we have any questions?
Thank you so much, Ken, for all of this. I just have a few questions, starting with the assessments. The first one, I guess assessment 10 that you said were mainly sidewalks, right?
Yeah, and utility infrastructure.
And utility infrastructure. Are there different ways, because that's the one that you said included the petition, the first two, that are really difficult because there's so many different property owners, and to get them to petition to agree to tax themselves is hard. Are there other ways to assign special assessments other than petitions, or is there an option to change that?
It's all set forth in the statute, so the only things that you can do a special assessment for without a petition are water, sanitary sewer, and stormwater projects.
I see. So you're saying that is the state assessment. So that's not a city thing that can be changed.
That is the enabling legislation that allows us to do these assessments.
Got it.
So that is a limitation. So Article 10A, which is really flexible in terms of how the money can be spent, is very prescriptive as to how the assessment is done and the need for a petition. So without that petition, there's no ability to impose this on property owners.
Are there other examples throughout the state of, is this just not used in the state at all because of that limitation, or are there examples from other areas of the state that do utilize it well?
The Waterstone project is the only one I personally know of, and if there's others, I don't think there's very many, because every time we've looked into it, it seems like the statute hasn't been used very often, if hardly at all. So I used the Waterstone as the case study because I knew it existed. I knew there had been one in Hillsborough, and I knew that, and of course Hillsborough is not very far away. If there's others, that would be a question we'd have to do a little bit more digging on. I've never heard of another one, but that doesn't mean there's not another one.
Understood. I'll hold off the rest of my questions for now. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Councilmember Fort?
A couple years ago, we put a tax increment grant process in place.
Yes.
Has anybody used that?
Not
since?
yet. And I think, we do have an adopted policy. The policy is on the website. I do have a letter of interest for a specific project that could be funded through a tax increment grant. Obviously, that would have to come through council after it's gone through a staff review. So the difference between the tax increment grant and the tax increment finance is that the financing is done on the private side. So the private partner finances and builds the infrastructure, and we reimburse them over time. So really what it is a form of reimbursement agreement. And of course, we've done a lot of reimbursement agreements. The difference between the tax increment grant and other types of reimbursements is that the schedule for reimbursement is based off of a percentage of the tax increment created by the new development. So you look at existing revenue, how much more taxes will be paid when the project is done, and you take, depending on location, either 50 or 75% of that tax increment and reimburse it to the developer. Why is it structured that way? I think it's structured that way so that you can show definitively that there's still a revenue positive flow from the development is just smaller over a period of time than it would be. So by benchmarking the reimbursement schedule against the tax increment, you can be assured that there's positive revenue flowing into the general fund from the project, but it's just not all of it. It's 25 to 50% of it over the lifetime of the grant. So from the other aspect of it is that and this is where Allison and our budget director would come in, is that, if I do reimbursement from another source, I need to have some CIP money sitting aside that provides me a source. The tax increment grant is kind of like, well, we're going to figure that out in a future budget year. And the cost is still there. It's just that we haven't identified a funding source at the time the tax increment grant's in front of you. And the payments, of course, don't start till later. So there's time to figure it out, but you are making a commitment to put that in a future budget if you were to accept the tax increment grant agreement.
All right, thank you.
Councilmember Patton.
Hi, thanks for this. I was curious on the tax increment financing, is there a public process like a hearing or anything required?
Well, I think it depends on whether you're using the project development finance statute or not. And I would defer to city attorney's office because I don't remember exactly. I'm sure there is a public hearing. I don't remember exactly what the terms of it are. I didn't really look into it because, quite frankly, I don't think we're ever going to use that statute. I can't think of any other large city that's used it. The only two examples I know of, one is the embarrassing theater in Roanoke Rapids, which got a lot of press.
Which is why nobody uses it.
Right. The other one was the research campus in Kannapolis, and which no one talks about, but there are a lot of buildings that were built there, and there seems to be a lot of activity happening. And I don't know if the finances of that project development financing district are good or not, but clearly something happened. But it wasn't as embarrassing as the. It didn't attract the same popular interest that the Randy Parton Theater did in Roanoke Rapids. But that was a big project, actually a much bigger project with a much bigger budget. And,
Annapolis has taken off, by the way.
yeah, and it seems like it's done, just judging from looking at it, it looks like it's done pretty well. A lot of research campus has been built there as a result of that project. And, Kannapolis is an example of a city that had a huge employer in Cannon Mills that all shuttered. And so they were facing, a jobs and tax-based crisis and felt the need to do something, and that was an opportunity for them to do something. Very different situation than Raleigh finds itself in. Sure.
Pat Young, Planning and Development. Allison can correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is if we try to use the TIF authority to secure a bond, those bonds get rated kind of as a junk status. We have a AAA bond rating, so we could borrow money at much more favorable rates than we would through a TIF process. So I just wanted to put an exclamation point on what Ken was saying, that it just doesn't have any advantage to us.
Got it, understood. And then on the first two, the 10 and the 10A,
Yeah.
what is there like a floor? I mean, when I look at that, like I think about how we ballot neighbors for lowering speed limits and other traffic calming measures, and I think about our residents who have come to us and said, like they haven't made the list of the 20 for that year. I mean, could an individual block of neighbors rally to use this tool for something as small as like a single traffic calming project? Is there a floor?
No, I don't think there is. I think an additional reason why maybe sometimes this authority isn't used as much as it is just a lack of awareness that it's there.
Got it. I'm not necessarily promoting that. I mean, we'd have lots to consider about like jumping lines. I was just curious if it was like.
Yeah, I mean, I think the
legal.
thing to remember, though, is a special assessment district doesn't impact taxpayers outside the district.
Right.
Because you're putting an assessment in place that's necessary to pay for the project that is being done within the special assessment district. So it only impacts folks within that district. So it seems to me to be, if you are jumping the line, you're doing it in a way that doesn't harm someone else's project per se, except for the level of staff capacity to execute on capital projects. That is a constraint by which line jumping could have an impact. But in terms of impact on other taxpayers, there should not be an impact.
Gotcha. And then my last question is, these are the tools that are available to us in North Carolina. Are you aware of any other tools that produce similar outcomes that are available in other states that we don't have access to right now?
I mean, I can tell you that other states have very different laws around tax increment finance, and they use it very differently from how we can use it in North Carolina.
Okay.
Like the TIF districts in Houston are very large. They're called tax increment reinvestment zones, or TIRZs, and they'll cover like an entire ward of the city. And basically it's available for all sorts of stuff. Now again, is that a value capture mechanism? It's more of a commitment that if growth happens in this area, we're going to recycle that money back into the specific area. And some of the TIRZs like have huge budgets, like they collect hundreds of millions, and like the Houston Medical Center sits in a TIRZ, and the whole Galleria area sits in a TIRZ.
Okay, cool.
But that's the main one I know. I haven't really looked into what the Special Assessment Authority is in other states for these types of direct infrastructure assessments.
Any other questions? Councilmember Jones?
Thank you. So out of the ones that you showed, the 10, 10A, the TIF, those seem like they're not really utilized. The one we utilize a lot is the MSD out of the options that you've shown us here.
Yeah, and mostly for services rather than infrastructure.
For sure, for sure. So as we continue down creating, because I know, as you explained before, we just went through the Blue Ridge, I think Midtown might be coming, and then we have the Dix Park possible, discussion about MSD.
Right.
As a city, as we're learning about it, what is the benefit? Is it consistent across all the MSDs? What is the city looking for in those MSDs to be that public benefit?
Well, I mean, it generally varies, but what you're looking to do is supplement basic city service with something extra in a special area that justifies the expenditure of money. So in downtown, an extra layer of safety and security and sanitation and marketing was deemed something that downtown would benefit from, and enough property owners agreed to that through the political process that accompanies the creation of MSD for that to have been established. It was originally established, downtown was a very different place that was struggling to overcome decades of decline. Downtown is in a different place now, but there's still, it's been durable, and you've just expanded it because the folks who pay that extra assessment believe there's value being created for that. So I think they've been mostly typically, in many other states, they're called business improvement districts. And they're common, and they've been a tool that's been around since the 70s, maybe older. And they've been a very common way to revitalize an old commercial area, I think, is where they've mostly been applied. But they could provide unique services in different areas, but you have to come up with I think a case as to why folks paying this special assessment are going to get a direct benefit for them that offsets that cost in some way by either increasing their overall value of their property or things of that nature.
Sure, and I think for me, going through the Blue Ridge, that was a question of concern for me, because whereas DRA, I can see you have the ambassadors. Same thing in Hillsborough, we had the ambassadors, and I can see that reflection of where we want those priorities. I didn't necessarily see that in Blue Ridge, and I'm wondering what is our role, whether that's the city or it's the city council, as we have those discussions. Is there a list of things that we want? Is it always going to be? Is there a rule to say that it always has to be safety or landscaping, or is there a template of things that we want to use as community benefits?
I think that's very much a council decision. I can tell you what the statute allows you to spend money on, and it's a wide range of services, and the capital facilities are very similar to Article 10A. So it's a very broad list of capital facilities you could spend it on. You could spend the money on streetscape improvements, pedestrian improvements, transportation improvements, things of that nature. Can't spend it on stadiums and golf courses and stuff like that. But so I think it's going to vary from district to district, but you do have to ask again that fundamental question, which is you're imposing additional tax burden on the folks within this district. What are they getting for that? And if you can answer that question and you know, because it's not petition, it's ultimately a political question, but obviously the council is responsible to the constituents, and the constituents in the district, if they're all opposed to it, you're unlikely to want to impose it on them, right? So even though there's not a petition requirement, you're going to want a district that makes sense for the people who are in the district, the majority of them.
And can those be used for capital improvements, MSD funds?
They can, but as I said, they're hard to borrow against. There's no special authority to borrow, so that for Article 10A assessments, you can directly book those revenues and use them to retire bonds. You can't do that in a municipal service district. You have to use some other bonding source. You can't just pledge the MSD revenues as the thing that pays off the bonds.
Okay. Thank you so much.
And also, over time, with the MSDs, like you've seen Hillsborough Street started out one way and has significantly grown its services as the area has grown. So
That's right.
it is a something that you look at almost 10 years down the road and have a vision about what can this be and how can we get there. And it's helping do that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in the case of Dix Park, you've got a park that's going to attract people from a very large area, but people from far away are going to go there a few times a year, and there's people who live really close to it who might go there a few times a week. And, you know, they would benefit from a high level of operational excellence within the park because they're frequent users of it, and it clearly impacts the property values around it. So that's some of the things you might weigh in making a decision as to whether that is an appropriate part of the funding package for the park.
Larry, you had your hand raised. You want to come up and ask a question? Make a comment?
Yeah, it's ironic that I'm here today. Midtown Plan has a project in it that was considered to be the jewel of the Midtown Plan, and that was the waterfront district. I've listened to Ken. It seems like the waterfront project fits it perfectly. The reason for the waterfront project was to take care of all the flooding that occurs on Wake Forest Road. Typically, that's the reason the cars have to be moved every time. The car dealerships are threatened by a flood coming from bad storm or hurricane. And what this project lacks is funding. It's the perfect commercial development. It's supposed to have affordable housing to it. And also it offers stormwater control to perhaps bring a flooded area into perhaps an attraction for the city rather than just something that everybody avoids every time it rains. So just bringing that to your attention.
Well, at one point, weren't we doing an MSD study in Midtown?
Still active. We're still discussing it. But
Still
this is a big
discussing it.
project. This would probably take a lot of tax money.
Just say that we're continuing to study that. We've put in for some grant funding to kind of take it whole. I do think that staff feels that value capture would definitely be an appropriate part of the funding strategy for the future Midtown Green concept. Appropriate? Yeah, would be appropriate because the park is, a park there would obviously be an amenity to many, but it would also have a very direct impact on the development prospects of that area by solving the existing problems of a lot of deteriorated property that sits in the floodplain, and so it can't really see investment, but it continues to kind of limp along, and so there's a lot of value that could be unleashed there that I think of value capture. It would be a very ripe opportunity for value capture to make an investment like that. And given all the other competing priorities in the park system, I think appropriate for a project like this, which is as much about creating a new development outcome as it is providing an open space resource. It's not like it's serving a neighborhood that's lacking in parks, but it would create a unique waterfront destination that Raleigh doesn't have, while also creating a lot of real estate value upland from it. No, actually, it's mostly private, and I think one of the issues is, are there tools we can use to encourage private land assembly that would include parkland dedication, which is a topic for another thing, but I do think that there may be a role for a zoning program that assists with that, but it would be a type of district that the city hasn't done before.
And one really quick question, just a clarifying, as we were talking about that water for the water project, is that the 10A or is that would
It
be?
was 10A.
So in Midtown, we could possibly, in this theoretical discussion that we're having, could have a 10A and a municipal service district. So there would be two different charges on residents?
Potentially, I mean, you can't jack the tax rate off on the property to whatever, there's going to be some limits on that. So I think whether it's not impossible, I don't believe, to put property in two different special taxing districts, but the limit on that is the tax increment, is the incremental rate you're charging on top of the base reasonable or not? We typically haven't doubled or tripled someone's property tax bill in one of these districts. So we look for the ratio of how much value there is in the district versus what we need to fund, and does that produce a rate that, while higher than the base rate, is still within the realm of reasonableness?
Thank you.
The MSA is still in progress, knowing that we missed the last tax cycle. We kind of put it off until the current tax cycle, but it's expected to come to council.
All right, any other questions? All right, thank you, Ken. Appreciate it. And next, we have the Midtown St. Albans Area Plan. Hannah? Oh, excuse me, we'll just report that out with no action taken.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, do you need a motion for that?
Yes, please.
Motion to move that item out of committee with just
No
for
action
information, with no
taken.
action.
All in favor? Aye. Okay, that was unanimous. Thank you. Hannah?
Good afternoon, Hannah Reckow, Planning and Development. So this item is the reconsideration of an area-specific guidance policy in the Midtown St. Albans area, specifically relating to affordable housing. As a reminder, it was referred here after the Planning Commission included that recommendation along with the report. So I'm just going to walk through, as a reminder, some background on the Midtown St. Albans plan.
Could you talk more into the mic?
Sure.
Thank you.
It's a new mic. Covered just some background on the Midtown St. Albans plan, kind of put those resulting policies in the context of the zoning incentives we already have, and then go over some options for consideration. So Midtown St. Albans area plan was a public process. Small area study adopted in 2020 was the result of several years of extensive engagement with the community, resulted in the Walkable Midtown Plan and a new section of area-specific guidance in the comprehensive plan. That latter piece is, as you know, used to review rezoning requests that come in that are located within that study area. And the policy in question is this one, APMT 13 affordability. It communicates an interest in rezoning proposals that have a residential component and are for 7 or more stories, contain some amount of affordable units. And that standard is set in that policy at 10% of the additional units affordable to 80% area median income for at least 10 years. So this policy, part of the plan adopted in 2020, was happening at a time where, sort of slightly overlapping separately, another city project was actively considering kind of our approach more broadly to affordability, particularly around transit, and that was the equitable development around transit project. So the result here is kind of two separate tools. In the case of Midtown, policy guidance, and then in the case of EDAT, a recommendation for regulatory incentives. And each of those, the standard was set in different places. And a key piece of work here that occurred in between these two projects was a market study conducted as part of EDAT that looked at like where to set the affordable housing incentives we use in the UDO. And so that's where that shift to 20% of additional units at 60% AMI for 30 years comes from. And we, as you know, we've used that in several places in the UDO, including the frequent transit development option and the transit overlay district to exceed so the base entitlement. There's that requirement to provide 20% of those extra units as affordable. So sort of a note on kind of these two tools. You know, of the two, using the UDO, regulatory incentives are more direct and often more effective tool. Policy guidance is a really great way to demonstrate and communicate a community's interest in something, but ultimately it is aspirational and the city can't directly enforce that. And policy ends up being implemented really through property owners coming forward with voluntary zoning conditions. So it's through that rezoning process that comes to be. So with that, walk through some options for consideration. If the committee feels that they'd like to amend the standard set in the Midtown Plan, that is something that could be done through the comprehensive plan amendment process. Alternatively, if the committee were more interested in expanding the use of the UDO via zoning incentives, whether to creating a new one or expanding where they currently apply, that process would happen through a text change. And then finally want to note that we're starting the process of writing a new comprehensive plan. So this is an opportunity to kind of take a step back and reconsider our approach to that. So you know, this reconsideration could be folded into that process as well. With the first two, you know, that decision would start a process that would then come back to you for a final decision. Actually, for all three, the comp plan, you'll see the comp plan too in a few years as well. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Okay. Councilmember Jones?
Thank you so much, Hannah. Excuse me. Do you have uptake on both the Midtown plans, affordable clause, and on the UDO? Like how many projects utilized each one of those?
Not readily available, although to my knowledge, I think we've seen recently with Z55, I think that was the first case we've seen.
For Midtown.
For
And then
Midtown.
for the UDO, has anyone taken up on the 20% or 20% with 60% AMI for 30 years?
Yeah.
Pat Young with Planning and Development. I don't think that's the case, and Hannah, help me out here. On the TOD, on the FTDO, we've had over 200 units that have taken advantage of that. The majority of those were associated with a tax credit project, so they were affordable. It's all affordable, but there are at least several score of private projects. These are in the pipeline. These have not been built yet, but they've been approved. So I think just piggybacking on Ken's presentation earlier, we feel like an administrative mechanism is a way to create certainty in the market, to allow the land value to help carry some of the subsidy costs that you heard from Ken about, and that if we properly calibrate it, it can be really productive and effective. So, thanks.
Councilmember Patton?
Yeah. Hi, Hannah. Thanks for this. I wanted to ask a few more questions about that market study that you mentioned occurring in between the creation of the Midtown Plan and the UDO provision. Like, I guess my question might just be like, can you talk more about that? But sub-questions would be like, who did it? Did their recommendation advise that this tool, that calibration be applied everywhere? Did they say that's a sweet spot? Or did they say there are areas of the city where this might not be the right calibration, et cetera?
Sure, yeah. So that study was a part of, I believe, part of EDAT. I'm going to look for confirmation, but I believe it was HRNA advisors that conducted that study. Really, we were looking for assistance in how to use the UDO specifically around transit. You know, it's equitable development around transit is sort of the focus of the project, right? So I think what we learned from that, you know, was that there's a little bit more of an appetite maybe for providing affordable units than we had thought previously.
Got it. But it isn't specifically called a question like, is this appropriate all around the city?
I don't know that that question was asked. I think
Okay.
it was more targeted.
But certainly where we have bus rapid transit lines planned, it seems to me that that
Yeah,
would be an
I'm
attraction.
Just trying to determine if they made any sort of analysis on whether the Midtown area would also have appetite for, or like support for this sort of deeper level of affordability that we see in the other one. Does that question make sense?
It does, and yes is the answer. I think the underlying issue here, as Ken alluded to, is there's enormous variability in land values in Raleigh from somewhere in the $100,000 per acre range to over $3 million an acre, so 30x. So in order to do what we think would have the biggest impact in this regard, which is apply this citywide, we'd have to have a lot more study. And when I use the term calibration, there'd probably have to be different bonuses for different areas based probably somewhat algorithmically on land value in order to get the production that we want. It's very complex. Communicating that to the public, engaging the public with that would take time. But I think in terms of consistently productive outcomes, that's what we think would be the most successful.
Got it. Okay. And if there were two maps, there's no, none of the, like, there's no TOD and there's no, like, FTDO in the Midtown. Those two maps do not overlap at all, is that right? They do. Larry's telling me they do.
I think the FTDO probably overlaps, but I can check that right now.
Okay.
For you.
Got it. And then I'm not coming around to a clear question, but I think, you know, Planning Commission asked us to consider this because of fear that because of the way the Midtown one is written, there's already a significant entitlement and that affordability may never be actualized. So I think that's what they were really asking us to noodle on. So I don't have a question here. I'm just talking into the wind. But
And just to confirm, yeah, there is FTDO is an option in, I would say, about the southern half of the Midtown area.
of the Midtown
Yeah.
plan. Okay, got it.
Can I ask a follow-up question of Pat? I know this is very complex, especially when it comes to, well, land values and whatnot. Is this something that's currently under study, or is it something you would need us to provide direction to study?
Yeah, great question, Mayor. I think we would need additional direction to study that. We would need third-party assistance firms that specialize in, like HRNA and this economic management. The way we've handled it so far, as Hannah alluded to, is on an area-by-area basis with the New Bern Corridor and Midtown. Those tend to have not uniform, but much more similar land values, and therefore it makes it more practical. And that is one way we could go at this, right? I think which is identify maybe a dozen or so sub-areas and study those over a 3 or 5 year period to make it more feasible. Certainly the comprehensive plan, our intention would be to look closely at this issue and bring you all a very detailed set of recommendations about a practical way we could get at this. I don't think we could probably do that kind of study all at once because of the cost and complexity, but we could break it into component parts where we have the biggest issues and opportunities with affordability. Thanks.
Thank you. Larry? You've been sitting patiently, so.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak. First of all, getting back to Megan's question, there were 3 parts to the Midtown's recommendation, and I wish I had a screen to put them up. And it brings us back to the Planning Commission. The three parts, this is only one part of the conditions for the Midtown plan. And I didn't write the plan, by the way. There was a consultant that wrote a great report in the end that it followed after all the public involvement with trying to develop the Midtown plan. It was basically promoted to help us get more infrastructure spending in Midtown because development was rampant, and that's what led to the Midtown plan. But it covered many more aspects, and one of the items in the Midtown plan was affordability, and that's what resulted in the clause that you're reviewing today. But the three elements of it, in addition to just this part of 10% of the units being affordable at 80% AMI, was it doesn't kick in until after entitlement. And that's part of the problem. It's part of the problem that the Planning Commission had, because depending on the trust in the developer, it may never get built. Now, in this particular case, we've got a lot of confidence that it will occur, and that's the only reason that we supported it to begin with. If it didn't have the affordability portion, we would never have supported this project because it is going to contribute to the problem with traffic on Six Forks. And there had to be some kind of conditional encouragement to get this thing approved, and this was it. The other thing that it has, make sure I tick them down to make sure we get them right, is pay in lieu of affordable housing. And there is a figure of $40,000 that can be paid per affordable unit. Now, I think historically there are a few developers that have utilized that. But I'm going to bring you back to one of the most famous cases in prior council history, and that is Smoky Hollow, Z319. In that case, they adopted what I'm going to ask you to do this afternoon. They adopted the recommendation of staff to follow according to a table and put in all the conditions varying from affordability at different percentages and different lengths of time. And they did not use the clause for pay in lieu of. That was something the council felt strongly about, and they held them to that. Unfortunately, as far as I know, Smoky Hollow still hasn't built affordable housing. It keeps saying it's going to be in the next development phase, but you know, how long you want to wait? It's 5 years, I guess.
Well, it's in the next phase, which is.
Still waiting,
was
right?
Separately zoned, and there were 5 affordable units included in that. Just
5?
4. 5.
Percentage-wise, that is at the 5% level, probably. Anyway, what I also wanted to say was it's very important to recognize that all of the affordable housing bonus programs or all the types of ordinances or recommendations that touch on affordable housing right now are all voluntary. There is nothing to force a developer to actually build affordable housing.
And Larry, you can't.
What's that?
You can't.
There you
Based
go.
on
Okay, you
state
can't.
law.
So it brings me back to Midtown. Midtown only has one tool in their toolbox to try to work with a developer to get affordable housing. This is it. It's not perfect. I said in front of the Planning Commission, this is what started all this discussion. I said everybody hopes that we could do better. 80% is a nice point to have affordable housing, but it is not the best outcome for everybody. So what I'm recommending today, back in 2019, there was a staff recommendation. I sent you all correspondence, and I hope you all read it. And I hope you look up the 2019 staff recommendation in concert with Housing and Neighborhoods, where also this $40,000 came up. I'd like to see you look again at that $40,000 or eliminate it. Eliminate the pay in lieu. That's the optimum. So they don't have a way out. Just hand the city money, which is too small an amount to actually do affordable housing. Either raise that amount up, that's the one item, but the other is to use the conditions that are outlined then in the staff recommendation, where it cites the 3 levels of affordability, 80%, 60%, and 30%, all at different terms, and adopt that, not just for the Midtown plan, but across the board as a staff recommendation every time a developer comes to you and says, I want to try to do affordable housing. And if you wanted to make a change in the Midtown plan, I would say that you do it long-term in adopting a consistent plan, not just for the Midtown plan, because the Midtown plan took a lot of public input. I don't think it's fair to just make a change. As far as I'm concerned, if I had to slide up in terms of what the options were, there's a fourth option. The one thing I would not like to see, and I can't speak for everybody in Midtown, but one thing I would not like to see is something that overrides that particular tool in the Midtown plan without more public consideration. I think looking at it in the comprehensive plan or just as affordability as a whole and making a good staff recommendation that could be applied across the city is a good way to go. So I'm asking you to look holistically at the city as a whole, not just the Midtown plan. The Planning Commission has been struggling with this over and over and over in terms of what is offered. Sometimes it's 1%, sometimes it's 2%, sometimes it's 5%. The case that we just approved, Z5523, it's a good thing I'm good with numbers, it carried the recommendation of the Midtown plan as it was written. It would be nice if there were other options available to both Midtown and other projects throughout the city. And I think that's where the focus ought to be. Overall, this amounts to, if everything gets built out the way it should be, this amounts to 5% affordable housing across the project. It's going to be, as Smoky Hollow, it's going to be incremental, where they have to build a certain portion and they build the affordable part towards the tail end. Gives them a chance to make income, and it's the same thing Kane says, chance to take in income to be able to afford the affordable housing increment. So that's my request today, is you look at the 2019 recommendation from staff, and there's a table that goes with it. I don't have it to put up in front of you today, but take a look at that before you make a decision in terms of the Midtown plan.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Well, I was just going to ask staff if they had any more details on that 2019.
Yeah, good afternoon again, Pat Young with Planning and Development. I'll certainly defer to the city attorney's office, but since 2019, there's been a series of cases and judicial actions and I think changes to statute that have made it clearer that we should not be making direct recommendations to applicants about the amount of any proffer or condition. Conditions have to be, as you all well know, strictly voluntary. We do have conditions that we provide information to applicants as to form, meaning how they should be written and the language in them at their request. So if they request it, it's voluntary. Mr. Halpin's certainly right that in 2019 there was some material provided to staff. I don't know to an applicant regarding this specific amount, but we have not been following that practice since at least 2019 because of these legal concerns. So I really wouldn't want to say anything beyond that, but I do think that's the main reason we have not been doing that. And now, when applicants ask, we'll either provide that or refer them to our colleagues in Housing and Neighborhoods, who are the ones that are directly associated with the production costs of housing, which of course does change over time. Brandon, is there anything you want to add to that?
I'll just add the guidance that Mr. Halfont was referring to was provided to the Growth and Natural Resources Committee in March of 2019. I actually had helped Nikki Jones, who was with Housing and Neighborhoods at the time, and Travis Crane put that together with those standards. That was in response to trying to figure out what affordable housing zoning conditions could look like. The city was being asked, because at that point nobody had offered one, and so the city was asked, well, what a prospective condition could look like, and as the speaker indicated, it was based on looking at percentage of AMI targeted, the length of time that the unit would be available to someone at that AMI, and what percentage of units could be provided for that.
So are you saying that the specifics of those conditions were not calibrated based on anything in particular? That was sort of just a template?
It was housing and neighborhood staff and planning staff just trying to put together what a template could look like.
Okay. So I have looked at this document. I can't quite remember what it says, but for the sake of the question, so if it says 15% at 80% for 30 years or 10% at, or 60%, what, like those the specific numbers in those slots are not based on like research or analysis?
I couldn't speak to where housing and neighborhoods came.
I thought they tied it into federal guidelines so that there's some way of getting vouchers or reimbursement for affordable housing. It wasn't just arbitrary, as I recall.
Right, the 80%, 60%, and 50% AMI requirements tied into certain levels under HUD programs for what's considered affordable rent at various incomes.
Yeah, but the amount and the term were
They were not tied to federal limits.
arbitrary.
10% would have been for 15 years rather than 10 that's in the Midtown plan, if they had followed that.
Right. I'm just trying to figure out where the root guidance is coming from. It sounds like maybe it was not, it was,
Yeah,
it was thoughtfully informed, but not necessarily by a specific piece of analysis the city ran.
correct. The income target started with HUD limits, and then the rest was just based on staff recommendations. And that was never anything that was formally adopted as guidance by the council.
There are legal issues connected with all of that. So we can't,
I never did
If
figure
we-
out where the pay in lieu of came from. That, somewhere in that time period got thrown in.
so what happened back then was there was an offer to do $1 million contribution to the city's housing fund. And that was rejected by council, and they negotiated,
It was a Smoky Hollow game, right?
yes.
I have a quick question to our legal team. As was said in the Planning Commission that Mr. Helfand alluded to, the additional units was where there was the concern. So right now, this is 10% of everything above entitlement. Is there legal ramifications for making it on the entire project so that it doesn't just happen after, in this case, the 954th unit? Is there a legal way that prohibits that from being added?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Sure. So I'm sorry, let me make that clearer. So in the Midtown plan, it says 80% AMI for 10 years at 10% of the units. But that only took effect in the last case, Z5523, after their entitlement. And their entitlement was 954 units. So that 10% of affordable doesn't even start until after that 954. So my question is are there legal ramifications for us changing the Midtown plan and going, okay, let's make it on the entire project instead of just over entitlement?
So defer to my colleague David York on specific planning and zoning questions. I think that the goal is stated in the comprehensive plan. It's an aspirational goal, like many of the goals in the comprehensive plan. And so it's not really necessarily tied to a specific threshold. It's just out there as guidance as to what the city would like to see happen in development in the small area.
So as an aspirational goal, one could say that the Midtown plan could ask for full, all units to be included instead of just over entitlement, because it's aspirational, it's not a requirement.
David York, City Attorney's Office. There's a practical aspect of it as well. If you're talking about a market developer, okay, which most of the zonings we see where we're negotiating affordable housing conditions, those are market rate developers. When a affordable housing developer comes up, they normally do not have an affordable housing condition in there. A few have, but very few have, because once they limit their property to require affordability, property value goes down, it messes up their opportunities and how much gap funding they can get. That's what we're hearing from them, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of those don't offer up conditions. So the irony is the affordable developers aren't really pushing these conditions. We are asking them of market rate developers. And so if the percentage is on the total, then there's less incentive to go through the rezoning hassle at all. That's why the, not hassle, it's a joy. No, it's a lot of money to spend and then lose the units you were counting on. As Ken alluded to earlier, how much they pay for the property, the dirt, is sort of already set by the time they get to the zoning case, if that makes sense. You
It
get the
does, but
property
I'm going
under-
to just interrupt really quickly. It does make sense if they've already purchased the property, but if this is a plan, an aspirational plan that people are now know is possible, then that's prior to them purchasing the land. So they don't have that
Yeah,
in,
I
in
understand.
hand.
I appreciate that, but the whole thing is, if it's a percentage of what you get from your rezoning request, as opposed to a percentage of what you're already entitled to do now, you lose incentive to do the rezoning. That's what I was getting at. If I can do 100 units today, and my rezoning only gets me 10 more units, I'm not going through that rezoning if I have to provide a percentage of the 10. I mean, if I have to provide a percentage of 110 as opposed to a percentage of a 10. That's, and we do have, that's not out of the realm of craziness for rezonings. We do have rezonings that are just gaining a handful of additional units. Oftentimes, the rezoning is a different classification, allows a different building type, which enables them to do things, or additional height and enables them to get just a handful more. And so if you look at the whole, they're not likely to do it. And then you lose the opportunity for some not as much, but some affordability. And I think that's what guided some of the comprehensive plan language. And most of the zoning cases we've had that have a 10% or a larger percentage, it's been on what I'm gaining from the rezoning rather than the total. When it's on the total, the percentage is down around 1%, sometimes 2%.
Right. So from what and I completely understand and respect what you're saying, that if we change those numbers and make it on the full entitlement, people don't want to, they'll just say, no, I don't want to do that, and I'm not going to follow that part. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and they don't have to, and you don't have to, I mean, compliance with the comprehensive plan is not required for approving a rezoning. Compliance with the comprehensive plan doesn't always guarantee you're going to be approved. But conditional use zoning, the more regimented we get it, the less voluntary it looks.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah,
that's
I hear
why
you, and I
it's
think that-
aspirational in the comprehensive plan. That's why it's based on what you gain from your rezoning.
Right.
Those are all factors that weigh into the.
For sure. And I think that as we, both by Planning Commission and by residents from that Midtown, in the first uptake of this, it was just going, okay, that value seems a little low. And that's what we heard from both Planning Commission and from residents in the area. And that was made a few years ago. So now having this be the first one, I think it's something that we're trying to put into our conversation as we move forward of how are we showing where our value lies for affordability, and how do we make sure that it measures up so we don't scare people away, so that people don't, and by people I mean market rate developers, because we want them to be our partners and we want them to continue to help us, because I was very excited to approve that, and so this is a delicate balance. How do we help incentivize more growth and affordability without completely stopping it because we've gone too far. So that's what I'm hearing in this conversation, and I wish I had answers for it, but
I wish I did too. I could put it on the road, but it still has to be something that's negotiated. The property owner, the applicant has to be comfortable with what's being asked and have to have confidence they're still going to be able to, you know,
Make the numbers work.
get the numbers to pencil out. That's why we're seeing we've had a few zoning cases come through where the reason someone is not taking advantage of the frequent transit development option is they were saying it didn't pencil out. They couldn't get the numbers to work. It's far easier for an affordable housing developer to provide market rate than it is for a market rate to provide affordable housing, because it's a total different world with all the reporting that's required and everything to make sure those rents are where they're supposed to be. So it's a big ask of a market rate developer to do any affordable. They almost have to cut it apart and have someone who's an affordable housing. There's some that do it, but it's not the norm.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can I go back to what was discussed earlier? Pat, you had mentioned what we can do. I'm going to go back to this. What can we do legally? And one of the things you'd mentioned was that study with the land values and whatnot. Is that the option?
Well, I think, again, Pat Young with Planning and Development, I think if council wants to move towards a model that relies more on a predictable administrative bonus program like the FTD or TOD, then that would be the first step. So we'd have to study and assess exactly as Councilmember Jones just kind of framed, what type of incentive will produce the outcomes we want with more affordable units without discouraging or disincentivizing, as Mr. York was just saying, the creation of units at all, or the any kind of upzoning and the ability to get those units. So that's a very delicate balance. It's a needle to thread, and it varies from property to property. But I do think that kind of study, like we did for New Bern and for Midtown, would be the right next step. As I noted, I do think it would be much more manageable, affordable, kind of comprehensible by both staff and the public if we do it in some kind of sub areas. But yes, I think that's exactly what we would recommend, because I think more broad applicability of these administrative bonus programs, like Ken alluded to, is the way to send the signal to the market that essentially that's the community's expectation if you want a certain height or density. To do it through the zoning process is just so challenging for the reasons that Mr. York and Mr. Bowers alluded to.
So, Pat, don't go away yet.
Yep, sorry.
Would a next step then being, coming out of here, a recommendation that you report back to council a potential plan for studying this?
Sure, we would welcome that, certainly.
Is that something that you want to pursue?
I think I have a few other questions before we go there. Yeah, I'm sorry, Larry. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Larry.
First of all, I appreciate everything that Mr. York just said. I wish he'd give that same talk to the Planning Commission. It's like a battle.
I don't disagree, because the Planning Commission, when they reject these because of not enough affordable housing, they're breaking the law, actually.
No, I didn't mean it that way. When you work with developers, it is an arbitration, and you're trying to get the best conditions you can for the public. But you have to be careful not to go too far, because as Mr. York mentioned, you're trying to get an agreement, and you don't want to go to the point where you've kind of pushed yourself into a corner saying, okay, it's 80%. We can't do less than that. And then they come back and say, well, we can't afford that. And everybody loses. So what I was suggesting is that you have to have some kind of, I won't call it vague language, but you have to have options in your language. And that's why I like the way the 2019 piece was written, because it covered 3 different levels of affordability with given times. And they were excellent suggestions for a developer to follow. And it's a good way to move forward. You know, I draw you back to the 2 zoning cases I mentioned earlier. One was the Kane development of Smoky Hollow. I looked at the conditions that were in there, and they were a mirror of the 2019 recommendation. And there was no how long it would take to do the affordability report. That was a negotiation after the fact that they would do it at some later point after they had enough profitability. I understand that. It's kind of the same thing we're talking about now with the recently approved Z5523. They're building in a transit development corridor, transit-oriented corridor. So the question was, well, you're asking for 5 stories along 6 Forks, where we say you should have had 3. And we said, okay, why don't you do the bonus? Why don't you take advantage of the affordability bonus? They said, we can't afford to do that. So we turned around to the other option, that was the 80% across the board. But that's the point. It's a negotiation. And you can't draw the rules so they are so tight that we lose the option of what's best for the public. And that's the only message I want to deliver. And those 2 cases are ways that it was found to be done, one, giving them both the profitability first and then the affordability in a lighter way. One actually was scripted into the condition, the other one was negotiated after the condition. So that's all. Just want to say that.
Larry, what I'm hearing from, I'm hearing that from you, but what I'm hearing from staff is that we can no longer do that 2019 because certain court cases have made things not legal.
Well, I think that's something you should check on further. I don't see where there's any provision not to do it. It's no different than all the other voluntary suggestions for affordability that we've currently been doing over the last couple of years. I don't see that distinction.
Okay.
So we have to decide what to do with this item first. We sent it here for consideration. It sounds like, Mr. Helfand, tell me if I got this right, but it sounds like your thought is to stay the course with what is in the Midtown Plan as adopted by the community at the time, and as we go to rewrite the next comprehensive plan, consider consider how affordability conditions would fit into the new Midtown Plan. That sounds like your preference. I'm comfortable with that, but I don't represent the area, so definitely defer to you, Councilmember Jones. And then just as a side note, staff, can you confirm, I think we learned once the 40,000 fee in lieu is related to the average city contribution to the production of 1 unit, which is roughly like 120,000, but the city's contribution to underwriting a single unit is usually 40,000. Is that?
Yeah, that was the former Housing Neighborhood Director's representation 3 or 4 years ago of the average gap financing contribution to produce 1 unit from the city of Raleigh. Yeah, that's right.
So may or may not still be true with current construction costs, but that's what it's based on.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think Councilmember Branch actually raised this question recently, and I think we looked back at it and still generally aligned with that 40,000-ish subsidy number. I know that there was a note that was put in a manager's update a couple months back, specifically on this topic, but have to dig it up. But if you're interested in reading the fuller review of that particular question, we could find it for you.
Yeah, that's what I remembered. I just want to make sure that piece was said it for the cameras and reaffirmed it. But okay, so you would like to wait to reevaluate any of these conditions or any of these policy guidance items for the next comprehensive plan. Councilmember Jones, how do you feel about that?
Well, I feel great about it. I think that especially what sent it here was Z55, and we had this conversation there, and they did in planning, which was we want to make sure that we are working with the developers who are coming, and this being that first one, we want to make sure that we're, yes, thank you for doing that, and just have the conversation. So I think this was more educational on what are the constraints, and I think that we need to continue that so that residents understand what those constraints are, because when we put out a Midtown plan and we say 80% AMI for 10 years, 10%, whatnot, and people go, oh, that's too little, that's too little. I want just, not me, but I want Mr. Helfand, I want everybody else to be able to explain that as well, so that it's not just falling on that one case, so we're putting it all on one developer who then is like, I followed all the rules. I followed all the rules and I'm still getting critiqued. And so I think this conversation to help educate the public is what we need to continue doing. So I am definitely in favor of not making any changes at this moment to the Midtown plan, but and I think Mayor Baldwin you were just mentioning that of possibly getting some how do we move forward? What are other ways that we can now continue this conversation forward, now knowing, what we'd like to do? I'd like to incentivize more, but I want to do it the right way.
So an option would be to report this out with no action taken, but a recommendation that this be looked at during the next comp planning phase. And then, why don't we do that first?
That sounds great.
Okay, that's the motion. Okay, all in favor? Aye. Okay, that was unanimous. The second item would be the study, and I asked how you all would feel about that. We could make a recommendation to have Pat come back to us with more details on what this would look like, what the cost would be, blah, 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 or at least some estimates, and then council can make a decision based on that. Is that-
That sounds great. And I have a quick question because, Pat, you were saying that you'd like to do it on smaller subsections, not just the whole city. So would part of that being to identify which subsections and what would you be looking for in that kind of guidance?
Yeah, that's a great question, Councilmember. I would need some more time with my staff to really get a handle on that. My request would be that if you consider further action, that we report back to you, and then we'll do the deep dive into that question and others when we bring that item back.
Sure, because I would definitely want to get the areas that are most critical of it as well. And I don't know what that is. It may be Midtown, it may not. And so I don't have the expertise to show that, but I would appreciate your guidance in that as well.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so the motion then would be to request that the planning staff bring back to council recommendations on future studies, on how we can incentivize legally affordable housing based on what we've done previously along New Bern. Okay, all in favor? Aye. Okay, that was unanimous. Thank you. All right. Well, everybody, thank you for being here today. And any more questions, comments, thoughts? Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you for being our guest today, Larry. You had the whole floor. All right, thank you.